Hi everyone, how are you doing today? I'm going to be sharing with you some thoughts on a novella that I read recently. It's called The Man Whom the Trees Loved by Algernon Blackwood. Now, you probably have no idea who Blackwood is, or if you do, kudos to you, but he's a relatively new author to me. Blackwood is one of the major writers of horror stories from the late 1800s to the early 1900s. So he was a contemporary of HP Lovecraft. Lovecraft actually looked up to Blackwood. He was a little bit older and considered him a modern master of the genre. So, if you've read The Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft or anything, you'll know that's pretty high praise. I have read Cthulhu, so I returned to this genre or category of writing like a year or two ago, and I actually was a little bit let down by Lovecraft, but I was very impressed by Blackwood. His two most famous stories are The Willows and The Wendigo. They are both short stories. And I read those. I found them very fun and entertaining. Very dated, unfortunately, even compared to like writings by Arthur Conan Doyle. I think Blackwood and Lovecraft are definitely more like problematic in their portrayals of other races, and so that's just a disclaimer. I mean, it comes with this time period. But as far as being horror stories or spooky stories, I thought they were very effective. I also read a story called The Doll, or rather I listened to a telling of it on YouTube. It had like creepy sound effects and everything. It was very campy, but it was it was an interesting way to spend an evening. I'll link to that in the description if you're interested. So anyway, but I was just kind of looking for a palate cleanser, if you will, a book to read in a little bit of a reading rut. And so I picked up The Man Whom the Trees Loved from Project Gutenberg. And what really struck me about this one in particular was its very simple setup. It's just about a man who loves trees. And then the book kind of expounds on that and talks about how the trees love this man. Now, I know it sounds incredibly cheesy and silly, but I was pleasantly surprised by it. It was not what I was expecting. So let me pull up my Gutenberg copy of it here and kind of go through my thoughts and notes. So it starts out in a very almost Tolkien-esque setting with this elderly couple who lives on the edge of a forest in England. And this couple is happily married, and the only problem is that while the wife is very content to live this quiet life in the the hillside country on the edge of the forest, the husband, he used to live a rather more adventurous life. His work used to take him into the jungles of India and elsewhere, and he has this great fondness for being in the forest and the jungle and enjoying nature and just getting outdoors. Like it's something that a lot of people enjoy, myself as well. And so that's a point of divide between them, something she doesn't really share. She was always the wife waiting at home for him and just had to accept that it was part of his job. And so now that he's retired from that, she's hoping for a peaceful life together with him in retirement. I think this is such a common struggle that couples go through. I say this as an unmarried person, right? Like, I'm not a retired married woman, but it's something you see a lot in your maybe it's family members or just neighbors. This kind of disconnect between two people advancing in age. So there's that, and unfortunately things take a sudden turn when her husband, I believe it is, commissions this painting of a cedar tree that stands in their front yard. Maybe it's their backyard. I don't recall now, but they have this tree in their yard, and he gets this artist to paint it. This artist has just got a real talent for painting trees. And through knowing this artist, the husband, whose name is, what is the husband's name? I think his name is Mr. Biddisy. Biddisy, is that the name? Okay, maybe I should have, his name is David. David. So in getting to know this artist, David's love for the forest is reawakened, and his passion for trees is, reawoken, and he becomes once again transfixed by the idea of this forest that they live nearby, and the possibility of the forest having its own life and spirit to it. And what exactly that means is actually a huge part of this book, which I thought was interesting. So that's the setup. And again, this book, it takes an angle that I was not expecting. We are with Mrs. Biddisy, David's wife, the entire way. She, in fact, is, I would say, our protagonist, which is not at all what I was expecting. And there's a dual conflict here, actually. There is the conflict in terms of marriage and closeness, and there is also a conflict in terms of, sorry, I'm trying to get back to the first page. There's also this conflict in terms of their different outlooks and beliefs, because Mrs. Biddisy is extremely religious, and or so she believes. I'll get into that a bit later. And her husband David is, not so religiously inclined. You could say he's more spiritually inclined in general, towards, whatever there may be, but he doesn't necessarily profess the kind of strong Christian faith that she does. And she's very concerned that he is interested in this mystical forest, and she's trying to make sense of it through her own faith and outlook, and not even trying to, like, at times she's trying to fit it into that, but also just ultimately she's trying to understand how to understand God in all this, and what's the meaning of this, and can she accept it in her faith. And I just thought that was such an unexpected angle. As a religious person myself, I thought that was surprising and unexpected. There are points earlier in the narrative, because this is third person, in spite of focusing on Mrs. Biddisy. There's points early in the narrative where you feel like Blackwood isn't really respecting her faith or her perspective, but as it goes on, in spite of that initial I would say skepticism on his part, or maybe even derision or mockery in parts, nonetheless, as the story goes on, I feel like there's less of that, and she becomes more of a serious character, and her fears and her anguish are very seriously considered in this, which I think lends this story a lot more depth than if it was just a horror story with a couple of scared characters, or one scared wife character. Like, she kind of transcends the trope in that sense, because of the gravitas that her point of view is given. And it could be that Blackwood was trying to connect with his readership, which may have leaned religious. This is he's British, so maybe he was thinking, I need to connect with that readership. I don't know, honestly. I just appreciate that she was given that consideration. Now, I'm not going to go too far into that because I feel like if I do that, it'll just be giving everything away. So let's focus on a couple other things I wanted to mention here. For example, I thought that this obsession with the forest was representing some kind of love affair on the husband's part, right? Because just the way he was talking about it, and there were allusions to, he seemed like to be as if he was like when he was back first in love with his wife Sophia. She notices that like this obsession he has seems to be as if they were young and in love, but it's not about her anymore, it's about this forest. I just thought, wow, so maybe this is actually about a love affair. As the story goes on, though, it gets deeper than that. So, here's a quote I want to share, kind of pertaining to what I talked about earlier. Mrs. Biddisy had balanced sanity and a fine, deep faith. She was greater than she knew. And that's the narrator talking here. It goes on, her love for her husband and her God were somehow one, an achievement only possible to a single-hearted nobility of soul. So Blackwood's almost painting that as a good thing, but I, as a religious person, I would say that, without giving too much away, this singular love that is somehow one for both God and husband is part of her problem. And I'm going to just leave that there. If you read the story, I would challenge you to think about what that means. I think it's actually a very big problem for her. But yeah, so here's a description. A forest made him happy and at peace. It nursed and fed and soothed his deepest moods. Trees influenced the sources of his life, lowered or raised the very heartbeat in him. Cut off from them, he languished as a lover of the sea can droop inland, or a mountaineer may pine in the flat monotony of the plains. I really love that description of David's love for the forest because I feel the same way, and I say that as someone who has lived away from forests, and I definitely know what that feels like. It is kind of like a relationship unto itself. I know that sounds a little crazy, but if there's somewhere that you really love, for some people it's the plains, the wide open spaces. For some people it's the desert. For some people it's the sea. But whatever it is, for me it is the forest. When you are that much accustomed to and attached to a place, it is extremely powerful. It is one of the most important things in your life. And I think that is what Blackwood is describing here with David. So that was just a lovely description. And again, this kind of elevates the book above campiness, above, just a light horror flick. It really gets to some universal themes that that many people may be able to understand here. So I was telling you earlier that I thought this book was about a marital affair, effectively, but I think it's actually, again, something far more, or not more, but something different. So as the story goes on, Mrs. Biddisy loses her connection with her husband in spite of there being no apparent marital problems. So that's where I think this idea of an affair fell apart. And I started to think more about people who suffer from dementia in old age. And if you've had to go through that painful experience of watching a family member go through that, then a lot of this will resonate. It was the house he hated, coming back to rooms and walls and furniture. The ceilings and closed windows confined him. Yet in it no suggestion that he found her irksome. Her presence seemed of no account at all. Indeed, he hardly noticed her. For whole long periods he lost her, did not know that she was there. He had no need of her. He lived alone. Each lived alone. And while this doesn't necessarily align perfectly with an experience of a couple where one has dementia, there's definitely distancing that happens in that situation. And especially if one spouse, for example, begins sleeping a lot more often and just isn't around in the way that they were, or when they are around, they aren't aware as much of what's going on, and that you lose them very, very slowly, and it's really painful. So that's what you see here with what Sophia, the wife, is experiencing. And I just, I definitely found that deeply moving, thinking about people I know who have experienced that. So that, along with the religious themes in this story, led me to really appreciate it and feel like it's actually been one of the best books I've read this year, because I've never encountered a book yet that goes into this set of topics in this way. There's many books that cover marital infidelities, many books that cover individual depression and loneliness, which is also an important topic. There's many books about obsession, many great classics about obsession about someone you love, or about about revenge, the revenge cycle. But a book about a loving relationship in decline, about old age and possibly some kind of dementia metaphor here. It's, that's something I just haven't encountered, perhaps ever before in fiction. And I certainly wasn't expecting it from Algernon Blackwood. I mentioned how much I enjoyed the Willows and the Wendigo and the Doll, but again, those are very, I would say, leaning on campy stories and just, stuff you read to have kind of a good time with the spook factor, but you don't go into it expecting deep analysis of relationships and faith and conflict that is of this nuanced nature. So yeah, I am greatly impressed by Blackwood now. And again, maybe this was like, because I've read reviews of his other books and they have very mixed reviews, and I'm not really interested in reading his novels about the occult or things of that like that. Like, I might try some at some point, but like it's not a topic I really want to read a lot about. And this book hits a middle ground in such depth that it was just very much, it just hit me out of the blue, and I found it, again, deeply moving. So, alright, I've gone on quite long about this. I will wrap it up there. A warm and a high recommendation, that sounds weird, a warm recommendation for The Man Whom the Trees Loved by Algernon Blackwood. It is a short novella. I don't even think it's 100 pages. You can get it on Project Gutenberg for free. Check LibriVox. One of the highlights of the year. So thanks for sticking with me, and if you've read any Blackwood, let me know what you think, or Lovecraft. This is a category of stories I do enjoy, and it's just so refreshing when you find one that carries this kind of depth to it. So thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye.